Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to this AAMC webinar on the topic of models for international research and collaboration. I hope that everyone out there can hear me loud and clear and see me. My name is Nicholas Chambers and I'm speaking with you from Sydney, Australia, and I'm joined by my co-moderator, Fernanda Pitta. Hi, Fernanda, who's dialing in from Sao Paulo, and we have panelist Ruben Keane in Brisbane, where it's just turned 7 in the morning, so go easy on Ruben. Hey, Ruben.
Hi, Ruben.
And Ilona Katzer in Los Angeles. Hi, Ilona. I think everyone's bios are online, so I won't go into in-depth introductions. And I also want to welcome the more than 40 AAMC members that are joining us from all across North America, and to make special mention of attendees who are tuning in from Macedonia, from England, from Switzerland, and from France. And I also want to thank Judith, Monica, and the rest of the AAMC team who've been working with us to organise this webinar over the past weeks and months. Okay, so the format this afternoon, this evening, will be to start with a short introduction from me and Fernanda before we hear from Ilona and Ruben, who are going to speak about a couple of projects in relation to the topic of this webinar. We want to keep things quite informal. We encourage you all to send questions. There's a little tab at the bottom of your screen. We may try to get to questions as the conversation unfolds, but we'll also endeavour to keep some time at the end to address the questions in a more focused way. And I should also remind everyone that this is being recorded and it will be available for everyone to view. So if you have to log out and want to check it out later, it'll be online in about a week. I also want to say up front that this webinar forms part of a Terra Foundation supported program, which is called the Engagement Program for International Curators. It's a program that Fernanda and I have been working on for about 18 months, I believe, maybe a little bit longer. And I've been working with a colleague in Houston. Shout out to Alison DeLeva Green at the Museum of Fine Arts, and Fernanda's been working with Anna Marley. Hi to Anna in Philadelphia. Anna's at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. And a quick plug for that program, Monica reminded me at the beginning that the next round of applications for the engagement program for international curators closes on 5 November. So I encourage you all to have a look on the AAMC website to learn more about that. Now, among the goals of that program is to support curators based outside of the United States to collaborate with American curators to generate new research programs. So that program is, in a way, a response to one of the key questions that's posed by this webinar. And that key question is to reiterate, how can museums meaningfully pursue original research across national borders? And I feel like I should state the obvious at this point, and that is to say that we are not talking about here large packaged exhibitions. And by way of example, here at the Art Gallery of New South Wales, in just 2 days' time, we'll be opening a show called Masterpieces from the Hermitage, which is a very beautiful show. It'll be, much loved by our visitors, but we're not talking about those kinds of programs here, but rather ones that involve new original research that are truly collaborative and which have the capacity to expand the kind of canonical art historical narratives, or perhaps to enable us to speak in a more nuanced way about the art of the present. Speaking for myself, I feel that these are the kinds of projects where our curatorial passions often lie, but which, despite all of the talk about an increasingly porous international art world, they are often projects that are difficult to find support for within our institutions. And by that I mean, aside from the financial pressures that come hand in hand with pretty much everything that we do, these projects usually have quite a slow burn. and that often doesn't mesh so neatly with museum exhibition schedules. I also wanted to say that there are, of course, examples where collaborative international research is truly built in to an institution's DNA, and I think that is to some extent the case for the Queensland Art Gallery, where Ruben is working, and also for the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, where Alona is based. And you know, I'm sure we can also point to other examples where agile entrepreneurial curators have managed to spearhead new initiatives that have helped their institutions forge meaningful collaborations with partners overseas. But just to wrap up my part of the introduction, and just to reflect on the situation here at the Art Gallery of New South Wales, we're in the process here of embarking on a new building project. And one of the sort of sound bites that's often bandied about when we talk about this project is that we are a global art museum for a global city. And so one of the ways that the curatorial team here at the gallery have been trying to kind of parse such a grandiose claim is to develop a set of programs that try and unpack exactly what that term global or international means from here, from the vantage point of Sydney, because obviously, you know, the world looks quite different from here than Sao Paulo or Los Angeles or New York or even, you know, Brisbane, just up the road from here in Sydney. So the thing that we're puzzling over is how to transform that communication soundbite, global art museum for a global city, into original, meaningful and collaborative programming with places in other parts of the world. And I put that out there, not necessarily something that I want you all to help me workshop, but just to, I guess, just introduce and to say why that topic kind of resonates, or how that resonates for us here in Sydney at this moment. Fernanda, did you want to add something from your perspective at the Pinacoteca?
Yes, thank you, Nicholas. I'd like to thank also Judith and Monica for leading us in this webinar. It's my second webinar, and I'm very pleased to participate in this discussion. I also like to thank Terra Foundation for the support of this fellowship that Nicholas and I have. It's been a very important experience and exchange with the American community for me, and this idea of broadening the reach of AAMC, I think it's very crucial and very welcome in this moment that we live. Well, I've been working with Anna Marley from PAFA in this partnership, and we are very interested in specifically developing our exhibition that we are planning together as a collaboration and a research collaboration from the beginning. Pinacoteca has experience in this area. We've done a major exhibition on landscape that was called A Picture in the Americas, sorry, and we worked with Georgiana Uliaki from AGO. We worked with PG from the Terra Foundation, and this exhibition was shown in the US and Brazil. With Anna, we are planning an exhibition that is more, even more, I think, ambitious. That is to show, to make a show on history painting throughout the Americas, thinking about history painting in the US. Yes, there is history painting in the US, and Mexico and Brazil. And for that, we need strategies and collaboration, research collaboration from the beginning. And we are dealing with the difficulties and challenges, and of course, the amount of things we have to learn to develop this kind of partnership. So we are also at this moment showing an exhibition that was designed in the US by two Latin American curators, Andrea Junta and Cecilia Fajardo-Gil for the LALA program of the Getty. And despite that, the fact that we didn't collaborate since the beginning with the research formally, of course, what Pinacoteca and like our art history milieu had a lot to do with that research too. So this is Radical Women that we are showing until November the 8th. And well, just to say that I'm looking forward to hear what Robin and Ilona are telling us today and discuss with you and hear your thoughts and questions for us to think together about those challenges.
Great, thank you. Well, I think we might now hand the mic and the camera over to Ilona. Did you want to share some words with us about your recent projects?
Yes, sure. Thank you so much for having me and having LACMA represented. It's wonderful. And thank you to Judith and Monica too for hosting this. The reason I was so attracted to the panel is because precisely this notion of international collaboration and what that means. And over the years, I've worked on a series of international shows, so I'm very aware of the numerous advantages of organizing these shows and also some of the pitfalls of kind of putting together these larger projects when it has to do with binational or multinational collaborations. This mainly has to do, from my point of view, sometimes with the challenges of translating cultures or just figuring out what the realities of each location are and trying to mesh expectations from the very beginning. So as you said, Nicolas, a lot of the challenges have to do from the get-go with financial matters. And from the point of view of the US, I think there's often this cute notion that museums, because we sit in the US, we come from an enormous amount of wealth and resources. But I think it's important for our colleagues elsewhere to know that we also struggle with many of the same issues that other museums across the globe struggle with in terms of setting things up from the very beginning and trying to kind of, again, mesh our expectations with the realities, the financial realities of our institutions. For this recent project, Painted in Mexico, that I organized with a institution in Mexico City, the Banco Nacional de Fomento Cultural Banamex, and the show ended up going to the Met, its last stop. We really created a close-knit partnership with the bank, but it's interesting that during that time, Mexico City, the reality of the country was also impacting the project. There was a tremendous financial downfall in Mexico at the time that was very much tied to political circumstances. So how the curators dealt with the reality of what it meant to have to cut an ideal, beautiful, luscious checklist into a more compact showing, that is something that we had to deal with from the get-go. And it was just a very practical matter. So I don't know if, Ruben, you've had to deal with similar issues.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for a number of reasons, those have been for relative differences in space that's available within an institution, budgets, as you say, and also sometimes local sensitivities where it might be a little difficult to contextualize a particular work within you know, a locality. Yeah, so those are areas that obviously require, and this is one of the benefits, I suppose, of kind of working curatorially with other institutions rather than just, you know, working on a kind of contractual basis where an exhibition moves from one location to another, is that you actually have that direct input of curators who know their audiences and know their institutional frameworks. Yeah. we certainly, we worked on an exhibition between 3 countries, Japan, Australia and Southeast Asia, that I might talk about a little later, but it's a really kind of good example of the need for local knowledge in each context.
Yeah, I think that point is really key, the idea of local knowledge and being aware that institutions have different expectations and have different needs and different audiences. For the Painted in Mexico exhibition, there were a few works that we felt that would not make such an impact in the US, where we were actually trying to open up the field to an audience that's not well acquainted with Spanish colonial painting, specifically Mexican 18th century painting. But whereas in Mexico City, there is a built-in audience for this material. So things that may have seemed very obvious to them were not as obvious for a US audience. So balancing those expectations and those different needs, curatorially, academically, and in terms of viewership, was one of the pivotal things that we had to address from the beginning.
Did you, Alona, did you make certain adjustments to the exhibition based on these different audiences or their spaces?
Yeah, we did, Nicholas. We, the spaces were different in the 3 venues. We tried, because of merely financial matters, we tried to keep the checklist as identical as possible in all 3 venues, but there were about, I would say, about 10 works that fluctuated from venue to venue. And namely, there were works in Mexico City that had not been seen there very much, or had not been interpreted by an academic community, and they were very important for my Mexican co-curators. But we felt here in the States that because of their condition, or the fact that other works that were more canonical in the field were not known, that we had to make some exchanges. So I'd say that there were about 10 works that we played with, just in terms of creating a narrative that would suit each institution a little better. And
how about the interpretation?
We were the really nice thing about this project is that intellectually, the curatorial team was very much in sync. So we tried to, the didactic material in each institution was fairly similar. One of the curators in Mexico made a few adjustments for the Mexico venue that had to do mostly with semantics, but it was the same content. And it was, again, just because things that seemed almost, if you will, almost like meat and potatoes for the US, just because we had to introduce the topic, they wanted to give it a little bit of a different spin. So we respected that, and we understood the need to do that in that menu. And I think just being mindful of those sensitivities from the get-go when you start organizing these exhibitions, for all our colleagues who are engaged in this kind of projects, if you can sort of have those conversations from the beginning, I think it would be really helpful in terms of managing everybody's expectations. Because invariably, when you bring people together from different environments and different institutions and with different histories, there's bound to be some kind of discrepancy in those, in how you organize those things. So the biggest lesson for me out of this last project was to try to kind of really address that head on from the very beginning.
Lona, how do you meet your co-curators? How did it happen that you decided to work together?
Well, I have been thinking about this idea for many, many years, but I never felt that the time was ripe in the US to do it. And certainly I'm very fortunate to work in an institution that has backed me with many of my projects that are a little outside of the canon or more traditional type of shows, which is what interests me. They're not blockbusters, they're not money makers. Sometimes their audience is very limited in comparison to other shows that are more audience geared. But I've been really lucky to have support within the institution, and just throughout the years been able to build up a collection and a program. So when I proposed this idea to Michael Govan, he was very receptive to it. And this was, I think it was 2009 or 2010. But I also knew full on well that this was a project that was about a different country, even though I'm binational, I'm from Mexico City too. But it's from a different country. I'm operating from the US. I could be operating anywhere else, but right now I'm in the US. And I didn't have at that time the sole expertise. So I thought it would be very arrogant to pretend to organize a project of another culture on my own. So I called on 3 colleagues that I think are highly talented and I respect their trajectory, and we came together, and that's how this whole project came about. So we traveled really for about 6 years all over Mexico. We were on the road constantly on small planes, buses, trucks, what you name it.
Whoa.
Just trying to, yeah, challenging places, some beautiful places, but we were just trying to, we just get the lay of the land and see what was out there. So we visited many churches throughout Mexico. Whenever one had a trip to, let's say, Europe, if I had to go to Paris for business, I would just make sure to visit private collections. We had a colleague based in Madrid who was kind of scouting out for works in Spain. So it was this expertise of different regions and different types of knowledge, really, that was what kind of made it possible. I don't think we could have done it otherwise.
Ilona, could I just ask as well, I mean, you've been at LACMA, I think, for about 15 years, 10, 15 years, is that right?
Talk about that, Nicolas.
No. The reason I linked with that is because it strikes me that, you must have done a lot of groundwork, like inside the institution, to be able to arrive at a place where you can propose a show like this, which, as you mentioned, is not a money-making exhibition. It's a research-based project that's a very serious and much-needed contribution to the field. I just wondered if you had any comments about what are the necessary layers inside the institution that you've had to kind of organize or have in place to be able to make this possible.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. It's really an insider's type of question, right? But I have been in the museum for 18 years, so it's more than 15. And I've seen many changes and shifts institutionally over this time period. I don't know how to word it exactly. Times are changing a huge deal. And I would just caution some of our colleagues about this sense, having a sense of entitlement, that you arrive in an institution and you are automatically, because you think you have a great topic, given the chance to implement it. There's a way of building on expertise and building on a proven track record that actually allows you to fly even more within your own institution and take more risks. So this notion of what I call institutional patience is really, it's really important to keep in mind as you try to really go deep into subjects that are not normally seen as canonical, or are not going to sort of bring a lot of wealth or visitors to the institution, but that are equally as important as we continue to open the field of art history. If that makes any sense.
It does, absolutely. Look, I'm also trying to vaguely keep us all on track. So I might now move to Ruben, and I think there's kind of an interesting segue there, possibly, Ruben, just with the Queensland Art Gallery where you're based. One of the shows that you've been involved in, I mean, I guess ever since you started at the museum, is the Age of Triennial, and this, unlike the scenario that we just heard about from Ilona, this is a project that is absolutely built into how the Queensland Art Gallery sees itself in relation to the city, but then also in relation to the wider world. So it really is a top-down project, but then within that, there's all sorts of possibilities for more kind of grassroots collaboration. And I know that you have a number of other projects to speak about as well. I wondered if we might start there, just a quick intro to the APT.
Yeah, so the APT is an interesting one. It's quite a long-standing event. We're actually about to open next month the 9th edition of the show. The first one opened in 1993 and was initially seen as a trilogy of exhibitions, but it was one that the institution continued. What was interesting, though, about the show is that I think it more or less departed from a hunch, or at least from an understanding that the complexion of Australian society at that time was changing. Since the 1970s, it's very hard to argue that the Australian population was a largely European one. Increasing Asian and Pacific migration had really seen a shift in the demographic within, certainly within Brisbane, but within Australia in general. But at the same time, the institution didn't have a huge amount of expertise in the field of contemporary Asian and Pacific art. So in its initial, the first 3 iterations, the institution invited a number of advisors and co-curators from throughout the region to really drive and oversee the selection of artists. So that was a really interesting model. It meant that by 1999, the 3rd edition, there was something like 52 or 53 curators working on the project, which I think is it's quite laudable in the sense of being a very open platform for research. Obviously, that's also a very difficult model to sustain. It's a very unwieldy model, and for the next few editions, the gallery, feeling that it had achieved some kind of critical mass in terms of research. It had employed curators who were specialists in these areas. So it became a much more sort of internally curated project. And now it's a bit of a synthesis, I think, of being an institutional project, but being a meeting point for researchers around the region. So what's interesting is that we do have a number of co-curators who are involved in each edition of the APT, typically for areas that we don't have staff expertise in. But increasingly, we're finding that institutional collaborations are becoming, it's a reality of the artistic landscape at the moment, that need to really combine resources. But also the benefit of bringing different skill sets, different types of resources to bear on producing artist projects. And so, where we're heading now with institutional collaborations is really in producing commissions for new works by artists, which really, enables us to do things beyond the conventional reach of the institution.
Ruben, I wanted to also ask you to speak about a show that you made in 2016 that was called Time with Others. It was a project that involved, I think, 4 other institutional partners, but was not a show on that scale. It was, a much more focused exhibition. So, I guess to start with, I'd just be keen to understand how that came about and who the partners were.
Yeah, that came about initially through a conversation between Kyungfa Che, who's a curator at the Museum of Contemporary Art Tokyo, and I. And it was because an opportunity had arisen in that the Japan Foundation Asia Center was being revived. Now, the Asia Center at the Japan Foundation has produced a number of very interesting research and exchange projects, including a couple that had been very influential on my early development as a curator in sort of seeing and modeling working methods after, particularly for looking at how Japan related to the rest of Asia. And that, to me at the time, was something that I could find analogous, I think, to the Australian situation. And this was part of an initiative that I think has rolled out over the past few years. It's ongoing till 2020 when the Tokyo Olympics opens. And it's specifically looking at Japanese exchange with countries from the ASEAN region. It was interesting actually that Kyungfa invited me to collaborate on the project because I'm in Australia. We're not actually part of ASEAN, but the Queensland Art Gallery through the APT has built up an extensive exhibition and collection history with Southeast Asia. But what it was also for Kyungfa was a way of moving away from this bilateral structure of these really kind of trade motivated exhibition exchanges. So we were able to invite a couple of other partners, Azusa Hashimoto from the National Museum of Art in Osaka, and Michelle Ho, who was at the Singapore Art Museum at the time. So what we were able to do was to construct a really curatorially driven project. I've been involved in institutional collaborations before that have been about the structuring an exchange between similar institutions in different localities, which have taken a long time to really sort of come to an understanding about and really find a curatorial direction. But for this one, we found a curatorial direction straight away, and it was to look at how artists were responding to new subjectivities developing in, let's call the Western Pacific region, in the context of globalization. How relationships between communities were actually being expressed in artworks. Now that's quite a cerebral way of coming at it. It was kind of no huge blockbuster. So I did have to do quite a bit of work within my institution to actually get the project off the ground. But it was something I really believed in, so I was able to persevere with it. But the two problems that were sort of before me was one, that we were producing the Asia Pacific Triennial at the time, and there was a risk of there being a perception that these two exhibitions were maybe too similar in terms of the cultures that they drew from, the kind of work that they would include. And the second one was that it was no blockbuster. And this was never going to be something that drew a huge audience. On the first point, I was able to argue that it would be a very different show. We had a very clear focus for that edition of the APT. Time of Others was, quite an intellectually framed show. The APT was one that was going to be featuring a lot of performance, looking at the body, whereas wasn't so much the case in Time of Others. But I think one of the stronger arguments I was able to make was that it was a relationship building project. It was a way of embedding real knowledge of the working methods of other institutions within our institution. And in that way, it would bring a lot of other people from within our institution on board with the project. And that has helped, I think, in setting up, a number of relationships. Ultimately, an ongoing memorandum of understanding with the Singapore Art Museum. We're producing a co-commission for this APT. We have discussions about further collaborations together. So that was certainly a good angle for advocating for this exhibition. The other one too was that it had support. It had the support of the Japan Foundation, and certainly having that financial backing makes arguing in your own institution a lot easier.
I wondered if you could just talk briefly about the fact that, so you had, was it 4 international partners on the show? I think 4.
Including us, yeah, that's right.
Including you. So you have 4 partners, 4 co-curators, each with their own institution, their own audience, their own museum managements and trustees and audiences to satisfy. Yeah. I just wondered if you could talk about how, the different expectations in terms of like what are the outcomes that the QAG wanted as opposed to Singapore and Osaka, and how you guys kind of negotiated that.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite interesting. To Alona's point before, the list of works really evolved quite substantially between institutions, to a point where some of the critical feedback was like, wow, this is an East Asian cities on the move. because artists were dropping in and dropping out of the show across the 4 exhibitions, and they each had a very, very different character, especially when installed. You know, that took place for a number of reasons. But one thing that's interesting to illustrate those different expectations, those different relationships with audiences, is the use of the banner image for the show in each location. Now, we had settled on a work by Anne Millet from her Events Ashore series, a very beautiful photograph of an American sentry on a ship that was assisting off Haiti. And he's standing on the edge of the ship with his gun relaxed, so the strap is on his back and the gun is actually sort of facing down. Now, that was too sensitive to show in Tokyo, where even though the MOT is a municipal museum, it has a you know, very proximate relationship to the national government in Japan. Now, that image was seen as anti-war in that context, and because the rearmament of Japan was a very sort of hot button political issue at that time, we couldn't use it. Instead, we used an image of, by the same artist, of firefighting training taking place on a ship. It was fine to use that in Osaka, where there's a bit of distance from the national government. In Singapore, another image was used. It was an image of a US Marine sitting next to a Buddhist monk in a hospital ship off Vietnam. And it was one that really fulfilled, I suppose, an institutional requirement in Singapore that the exhibition or the gallery as a whole be representative of Southeast Asia. And in Brisbane, I proposed using that image, but there was a lot of pushback at the gallery because it was seen as pro-gun. And that was something that the gallery, you know, didn't really want to go near. So, you know, from one perspective, the same image being seen as anti-war, and in another context being sort of seen as pro-gun. And those institutional sensitivities towards the way that their audiences will interpret a given image was never so pronounced for me as in that instance.
I would like to ask how you think also those different perspectives impact the field in each place that the exhibitions were shown. I mean, you were working with different people in different contexts, different perspectives on history of art, and how do you think the collaboration impact shifting, changing, improving, enriching the environment or the field of art history in each place?
That's interesting. Without going into too many particular examples, when we first showed the exhibition in Tokyo, we got the feedback that it was actually unusual to see Japanese artists shown alongside artists from Southeast Asia, let alone from the Pacific. Japan has had, I think, a really great history of actually building research and collecting Southeast Asian art, but it was interesting to note that this has often been done in quite a siloed way. You know, with one or two exceptions, dialogues between artists haven't really been constructed, and that I thought was a really positive contribution to a discussion of how Japan related to the rest of Asia, where I think up until that point, the major point of institutional obsession or institutional anxiety had really lain with how it related to China, you know, with this kind of burgeoning art market and very, very healthy contemporary art scene. In Southeast Asia and in Singapore in particular, it was interesting to build a bit of discursive depth, which I think is an ongoing project in Singapore. And there's already some very healthy research, and there certainly was at around the time that we opened the show at Singapore Art Museum, the National Gallery Singapore had been inaugurated, and its extraordinary collection of modern Southeast Asian art, or Southeast Asian art since the mid-19th century, provided a very fortunate context, I think, for what we were doing. And in Australia, we were able to, again, build this discursive depth and do something that allowed for greater contextualization, I think, of more difficult questions than the structure of the Asia-Pacific Triennial sometimes allows. Now, the APT is an exhibition with more than 80 artists, and it's an exhibition that takes up a huge amount of our gallery space. I would estimate between 8,000 and 10,000 square meters. On such a scale, it can often be very difficult to contextualize particularly difficult questions or very highly nuanced positions. And doing an exhibition on a smaller scale really allowed us to do some of these things in depth and to maybe build more robust dialogues between distinct practices.
Thanks, Ruben. I noticed that we have a little over 15 minutes left in the session. I really encourage AAMC members who are tuning in to submit questions. One that I wanted to sort of put to the panel, because I'm aware that all of us are working for relatively large and, in the scheme of the international art world, well-resourced institutions. I think we all probably work for public institutions as well. So when we're talking about international research collaborations, it's often the case that, you know, we are the large partner working with a smaller collaborator in another part of the world. Less resourced, often a smaller space, fewer staff, so on and so forth. So my question is, in those instances where there is this potential sort of power imbalance, shall we say, what's in it? What's in it for the collaborator? You know, we can see all the benefits for our home city and for our audiences, but I'd just be interested to hear what you think of the outcomes, the kind of contribution that's being made to the partners. A curly question.
An excellent question, and it's a really complicated one too, because I mean, the sort of the core of the matter is that there is a power imbalance, and it's interesting because I was just sitting at a meeting yesterday where we were talking about perhaps organizing an exhibition. It's a different department within the museum, and sending it to Mexico City, but the sort of the price tag for organizing the exhibition that our partners in Mexico would like is much higher than what they can afford. So the sort of, as we increasingly, some of our institutions move more into this corporate model of organizing projects, it seemed like, what is the benefit to us to do that when we are existing in this global market? We don't have the resources to, this is a position of somebody in charge of orchestrating all of that. What is the advantage to us who has, we would have to invest all this time and staff and resources in getting this package to go to another country that can't afford the project? So maybe we should just nix it, not even sort of have it on the table. But I think for us curators who are, and this is kind of a tension between the corporate model of institutions and the curatorial voice, who generally are more interested in establishing bridges with cultures, with colleagues, we just would love to make accessible more materials, especially to countries and institutions that don't have the ability, precisely that don't have the ability to bring those materials to their own location. So how, I mean, one of the question is, how do you address that imbalance within your own institution?
Yeah, it's a good point, actually. I mean, it provided us with some interesting opportunities working on time of others. One of the interesting things was that Singapore Art Museum is, of course, a much smaller institution. It's about 25% of the size and staffing. Singapore, however, is, well, the arts in Singapore has been very well funded, especially recently. One of the things that quite a clever staff member in the institution was able to do was to find professional development money to actually send staff from a whole range of their departments to shadow staff in ours while we installed the exhibition, and also while we de-installed it, which was a great professional development opportunity for everybody across the board. The politics, though, you don't want to be in this position of being the kind of great authority, the master, teaching all the time. There has to be something that you learn, and you're right. I think those internal transformations within the institution are just as significant.
So I'm going to share a question now. Oh, I'm sorry, Ilona. Did you want to follow up there?
Can I jump in? And we have questions from our attendees, and I can throw the first one that Maria Safiotti Dali is asking if any of you have experience working with university museums. And maybe you can also add an answer that comes, question that comes from Susanna Milewska about funding and in the US. So university museums, research, museums, and funding. Ilona, Ryben?
I haven't worked in university museums, but I have to say I have some very dear colleagues that do. One part of me is extremely jealous of them because of the proximity that their exhibition and collection practice has to research, and the extraordinary spaces of and platforms that these universities can create. At the same time, I'm aware of the way that these university museums are subject to the same cuts and limitations that are being placed on universities more generally. And I understand that they're in an increasingly precarious position, or one at least that requires some negotiation in order to maintain these projects. But I don't have the personal experience of working in them.
I think that, and I know Maria Safiotti, so hi, Maria. I think it's a really great question, and I can speak for LACMA that I know one of the main concerns of the museum is to have as much outreach as possible. So especially now that we are in this phase of reconstructing, restructuring, and remodeling the museum, one of the prime concerns has been to make our collections available to as many institutions as possible, including university collections. So it's university collections are really a wonderful place that allow the collections to serve as objects of study, and you have a sort of a built-in student body, which is not always the case with museums. In our situation, when we have a historical exhibition or any sort of exhibition, really, we try to work, some of us at least, try to work closely with our colleagues in universities and partner up for either teaching courses or offering symposiums, because it's there's this enormous synergy between what universities curricula and museums are doing in terms of creating and sharing knowledge. So the more attuned we can be to our partners in different institutions that have the same mission, I think we all gain much more in the process. I don't know if that answers, but that's at least what we try to do here.
And about funding, our attendee Susanna Milewska is asking that, and I would add, how do you tailor the project to convince research institutions that fund research, but are not, many times are not funding exhibitions or with like understanding exhibitions as part of a research idea more broadly, and on the contrary, convincing sponsors and other supporters that research is necessary and comes really early in the project development.
Ruben?
It's a really good question, because it's really an ongoing process. That the situation is always changing with regard to funding and sponsorship. With regard to research funding, the question is really one around outcomes. What outcomes are possible? An exhibition is one thing, but within institutions we have the opportunity to, facilitate symposia and also publishing, and not just catalogs, but to actually facilitate, research by independent or academically affiliated researchers. So I think within our institutions, we still need to advocate for these platforms being a function of the institution, when the focus is really on getting people through the door for exhibitions. So those things are linked, I think, in that regard. With regard to sponsors, certainly our governmental sponsors or public sponsors are often quite open to the research component. Sometimes it's a matter of finding sponsors who'll fund the research, and then separate sponsors who'll fund the logistics or the operational side of putting an exhibition together. But these structures change. They tend to change with each government, depending on the country that you're working with, or even the state you're working in. So there's no hard and fast answer, unfortunately.
Yeah, I just add that one funding source that's particularly relevant to collaborations between universities and museums that's possible here in Australia are research grants that are attached to postgraduate work. And as a curator, semi-regularly, one will be approached by a PhD candidate or someone that's teaching PhD students about a research project, and there are often relatively generous funds available. One of the challenges, though, that I always find in having those discussions is that the timeline for the university research might be 5 years, something along those lines. Whereas in the museum world, having some kind of commitment from the institution that in 5 years' time we will do an exhibition of said scale is really tricky. So there's just those kind of different timeframes that make things complex. We haven't got much time left. I thought I would just jump. There is an outstanding question from Adam Harris. Hi, Adam, who writes, how have the panelists dealt with simple issues like language differences, things getting lost in translation, etc.? Yeah. Does the level of discussion get simplified due to these issues, and how do you mitigate against that?
I mean, that's an interesting one. In the example of Time of Others, obviously we ended up producing bilingual materials. The exhibition was between Australia, Singapore, and Japan, so the catalogue was in English and Japanese. The reason being that English is one of 4 national languages in Singapore. However, the signage when we showed the exhibition in Singapore was in all 4 languages, which I thought was really wonderful, actually. And it added, a really nice additional element to the show. It did throw up problems, though, and there were, say, text-based works, for example, which can be very, very difficult to contextualize. And so one of the works that sort of came in and out of the exhibition was a work that used a lot of English language texts. Now with video, it's quite easy to subtitle and you know, have a work move across borders, but it's a lot harder with a plastic work, I think. And because the impact of text and meaning in a first language is very, very different to when it's translated. And so in those cases, the decision was made by the curators, you know, in Japan to not include that work. And that was one of the kind of the interesting deciding factors about the way that operated. So, you know, in other cases where there wasn't a proximity of meaning to the visual function of the text, we were able to provide translations. So, for example, like in instructional conceptual pieces, for example, that's a much more straightforward way of doing it. But you know, it does play a factor in certainly in the choice of artworks. Absolutely. I mean, from my research more generally, where I'm not proficient in a local language, and I have to say I'm only proficient in English and Japanese, I will often work with a translator, sometimes hire a translator when I'm doing field research, in order to actually you know, be sure that the artist is able to articulate themselves fully.
Yeah, I mean, one of the larger questions, it's a really interesting and very hotly debated question, this issue of translation. I mean, I'm sitting in California where you have a large group of people from Latin American and Latino background, a very large group of Asian people. So then there's many, it's a place that's made up of many different constituencies of people. So it used to be that we provided Spanish translations for most of our exhibitions that had to do only with Latin American subjects. But how do you justify doing that for those type of shows and not for other shows? And why just include one language when you know that your audience is much more complex than that? So it's, at the moment, we are still working and sort of defining all those parameters. We have something in place that's more streamlined, but it's by no means perfect. And it's it goes to the sort of the very heart of the matter, which is inclusiveness within the institutional setting. How do you create, especially now that museums are changing so much, and we have to ensure that they change in such a way that they become much more inclusive and much more relevant to our audiences today. That language is really at the heart of the matter, and providing good translations too that are not just Mickey Mouse translations, which I often see, and I'm sure all of us have seen that in museums, all of us who are bilingual, that you just see this really, really, really sort of unacceptable translations, which for somebody who's a native speaker, that's almost a sign of disrespect. So all of those are really nuanced matters that institutions, not only sort of from their education departments, but also curatorial and other sort of aspects of the museum need to in my opinion, to really think carefully, because it is really about inclusiveness.
Absolutely.
Terrific. Well, everyone, we have hit 1 minute before finishing time. So look, I think it's probably a moment to thank everybody for tuning in from across the States, England, Switzerland, Macedonia, and France. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you very much to Fernanda and Ilona and Ruben. I think it's been such an interesting and thoughtful discussion. We've talked about such a diverse range of projects. I'd remind everyone that the session has been recorded and will be available on the website in about a week's time. And I'm going to go and have my first cup of coffee. You all are going to go and mix your martinis. And thank you and bid farewell.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nick.